She wasn't her mother. She couldn't fix what was broken. The North needed new hands to lead them, and those hands weren't her own. Forming an alliance with the West wouldn't hurt them, but it certainly wouldn't help them in the way Talbot thought. He had grand ideas of royalty again, but the North was too far gone. Even she knew that. He was just grasping. Cirque wouldn't fix the North. He'd take it over, and it would no longer be. But she would have to take that chance. She refused to let the tears fall. She wouldn't show him any sign of weakness. Let him think he'd won. Fine. I will wed him. Talbot laughed in glee and clapped his hands together. Oh, sweet Melody. Oh, my dear, you have made the correct choice. He wiped his eyes and nodded. You'll see. Melody didn't believe him for a second, and she couldn't bring herself to share his joy. She knew her uncle was getting a payout. That's how it always worked. He would take his riches and flee, forcing her and her sisters to suffer the consequences of his actions. She nibbled her lip, wondering how she would get out of it. There had to be a way. But first, she had to talk to Haven. Her sister needed to know the plan their uncle had devised. This will be our ruin, she warned, and yanked the door open. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need to hear what he had to say. Instead, she stormed out of the room, leaving her uncle in his utter madness. Because, after all, that's what it had to be. There was no better explanation. He'd fallen into his greed, and nothing or no one could stop him. Her father leaving him in charge of their estate was the poorest decision he could have made. Uncle Talbot would wring them dry until the North would no longer be. He signed their lives away to the West. She shuddered. Not if I have anything to say about it. She wouldn't let them win, even if that meant taking herself and her sisters out of Faerie for good. There was nothing left for them anyway. She needed a plan, and fast. But how could she save herself and both of her sisters from a life her uncle tried to force upon them? Dixon was sick and tired of living every day the same, but he was stuck. He had no idea how to make the changes he wanted for himself. Something niggled at the back of his mind. It was as if he was missing a vital piece of his life. Deep down, he knew what it was, but he had no clue as to how to find the one thing he was lacking in his life. So, until he figured that out, it was the same thing day in and day out. Every day, he went to work, put in his 10 hours, and then he'd ride. Years ago, he was surprised when he found out that he wasn't lion enough for horses to dislike him. In fact, he seemed to have an affinity for them. It was probably one of the only good things that came out of being a dud. That, and being able to get nicely drunk. Most shifters metabolized alcoholic drinks too fast, so it did them no good. But he was able to get well and truly wasted. It helped pass the time. Then he'd drive home and fall into bed before he had to wake up and do it all again. Beck was the only friend he'd managed to make in Kinquetta. From what he could tell, the big grizzly didn't much care for people. Strangely enough, he owned and ran the bar Dixon visited each night. It had taken some time, but after months, he and the larger man had a silent agreement and formed their idea of friendship. Kinquetta wasn't what he considered a major city, but it was bigger than any of the other smaller towns that surrounded the area. It's where all the locals came to find excitement. It wasn't anything like the cities he'd lived before, but it beat having his ass handed to him by every female he happened across. Talk about an ego burst. Female lions were tough by design, but the fact he couldn't even defend himself properly against them made his life a joke. No pride wanted him. He was useless, they said. How was it his fault? He was a dud. He didn't ask to not be able to shift. Hell, the lion roamed inside of him anxious to be let free, but it just wouldn't happen. No matter what he tried, the beast lay inside of him, with a body that deemed it dormant. But the problem was, his beast was very much its own entity, an entity that wanted freedom and wasn't about to give up. No one knew why he couldn't shift. Rumors spread that he wasn't even a pure. Everyone called him a freak half-breed. He grew tired of the bullies and the taunts, so he bulked up and fought his way through it all. Only, it didn't gain him the respect he deserved. Instead, it made him even worse of an outcast.